When my father's new wife corrected me about my own childhood, right there at the dinner table, I felt something old and fragile crack open inside my chest. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way she smiled when she said them, polite, certain, as if she had been there, as if she knew. I remember the clink of my fork against the plate, too loud in the quiet that followed. I remember my father clearing his throat, not looking at me, and I remember thinking, so this is the cost of forgiveness. For years, I had imagined reconciliation with my father as something soft, gentle, maybe even healing. I pictured long talks on the porch, the smell of coffee in the morning, him finally saying the things he never said when I was a child. I told myself that people grow, that time smooths rough edges, that holding on to anger only keeps you stuck in the past. What I didn't imagine was sitting across from a woman who wore my father's last name like armor, using my grace as permission to rewrite my place in his life. That night, as I drove home, the dashboard lights blurred through my tears. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was ashamed. Ashamed that I had hoped for something simple. Ashamed that I had ignored the small, quiet warnings I felt in my body the moment she entered the room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before she crossed the line, before forgiveness turned into something sharp and dangerous, there was a long stretch of silence between my father and me. Years, really. Years where we existed in the same city but lived as strangers, orbiting the same holidays without ever colliding. Growing up, my father was the kind of man who took up space without saying much. He worked hard, paid bills on time, and believed that love was something you demonstrated by providing, not by listening. When my mother died suddenly, that quiet became a wall neither of us knew how to climb. I was 19 then, old enough to understand grief, young enough to need him anyway. Instead of reaching for me, he retreated. He started staying late at work. I started packing my life into boxes and leaving the house for longer stretches. Our conversations turned practical, short, necessary. Eventually, they stopped altogether. I married, divorced, built a life that looked sturdy from the outside, a small house with creaky floors, a job that paid the bills, friends who knew how to sit with me in silence. From time to time, someone would ask about my father, and I'd shrug in a way that suggested indifference, though it never really was. Then, one afternoon, years later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. His voice sounded older, thinner. He said my name the way he used to when I was small, careful and unsure, like he wasn't certain he still had the right to say it. I got married, he told me, after an awkward pause. I sat on the edge of my couch, staring at a crack in the wall that I'd been meaning to fix for months. Okay, I said. It was the only word that came. He said her name, Margaret, and waited, as if I might respond with enthusiasm. I didn't. What I felt was a strange mix of relief and loss. Relief that he hadn't called just to be sick or dying. Loss that I wasn't part of his new beginning. He'd like to meet you, he added, when you're ready. I told him I'd think about it, and I did, for weeks. Forgiveness isn't a single decision. It's a series of small ones made daily, often without applause. I decided to answer his calls. Then I decided to meet him for coffee. Then, one quiet Sunday, I agreed to have dinner with him and his wife. Margaret opened the door with a smile that was practiced but warm enough to pass. Her house smelled like lemon cleaner and something roasting in the oven. She hugged me quickly as if we were already familiar and called me sweetheart in a way that felt too soon. My father hovered behind her, hands in his pockets, eyes searching my face for cues. I wanted to be generous. I wanted to believe this woman had brought him comfort in his loneliness. So I smiled. I brought a bottle of wine. I asked questions. That first dinner went well enough. Margaret talked easily, filling in silences with stories about her church group, her volunteer work, the way she and my father met at a community fundraiser. She spoke of him with admiration, sometimes correcting him lightly as if that was her role now. I noticed things, though, small things, the way she answered questions meant for him, the way she referred to his past in broad strokes, sanding down details that mattered to me. When I mentioned my mother, she nodded sympathetically, but redirected the conversation quickly, like someone changing the subject from an uncomfortable stain. Still, I told myself I was being sensitive, protective of old wounds. I reminded myself why I was there, to build something new, not dig through what was already broken. Over the next few months, I visited more often. Birthdays, holidays. I watched my father soften around her, laugh more easily, lean into the domestic rhythms of shared meals and early mornings. Part of me was glad he wasn't alone anymore. Another part felt like a guest in a house that used to be mine. Margaret began offering advice I hadn't asked for, about my job, my dating life, the way I spoke about my past. She framed it all as concern, as wisdom earned through experience. "I just want what's best for you," she'd say, placing a hand over mine a second too long. The first real discomfort came the day she suggested I should let go of certain memories because they made my father uncomfortable. "He's older now," she said gently, pouring tea into delicate cups she insisted we use only for company. I looked at my father then, waiting for him to say something. He stared into his cup. I swallowed my response and told myself this was part of blending families, that healing required compromise, that forgiveness meant not always being understood. But forgiveness, I was learning, can be mistaken for permission, and Margaret was beginning to test just how much space she could take. That dinner, the one where she corrected my childhood, was still weeks away. At that point, I didn't know that my quiet endurance was being measured, that every silence was being counted as agreement. All I knew was that something inside me had started to ache again, a familiar ache, the kind that warns you before a storm. I ignored it. For a while. The ache didn't announce itself loudly. It settled in slowly, like a draft you don't notice until you're already cold. I kept going to my father's house because I told myself consistency mattered. Healing required showing up, even when it was uncomfortable. I brought dessert. I helped clear dishes. I listened more than I spoke. Margaret seemed to appreciate this version of me, the agreeable daughter who didn't ask for too much space. But little by little, she began to rearrange the story of our family, and she did it with such calm confidence that it almost sounded reasonable. She'd say things like, "Your father wasn't ready to be a single parent," when referring to the years after my mother died, or, "You were very independent even back then," whenever I mentioned feeling lonely as a teenager. Each comment landed softly, wrapped in a tone of understanding, but together they formed a picture where my hurt was exaggerated and my father's absence was inevitable. I'd nod, smile, take another sip of tea. Inside, though, something tightened. One afternoon, I stopped by unannounced, a habit I still hadn't broken from childhood. Margaret was in the living room, reorganizing shelves that used to hold old photo albums, the ones with birthdays, school plays, my mother's handwriting on the back of pictures. "Where did the albums go?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't look up. "Oh, those. I put them in storage. Your father thought it was time." I stood there, keys still in my hand. "Time for what?" "For moving forward," she said, finally meeting my eyes. "We don't want to live in the past." That night, I lay awake replaying the conversation, telling myself she meant well, that couples make decisions together, that this was her home now, too. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something precious had been quietly boxed away without my consent. The next clue came disguised as kindness. Margaret called me one morning to ask if I could help my father with some paperwork. "Insurance forms," she said. He trusted me with details like that. I felt oddly honored, useful, included. When I arrived, she hovered as I reviewed documents at the kitchen table. She corrected me when I explained something to him, finished his sentences. At one point, she laughed lightly and said, "You know, you always were the dramatic one." The words sat between us like a pebble in my shoe. After she stepped out to take a phone call, my father leaned closer and lowered his voice. "She means well," he said, almost apologetically. "She's just trying to help." I wanted to ask him if he noticed how often she spoke for him, if he realized how small he looked when he deferred to her on matters that used to belong to us. But I didn't. Old habits are hard to break. I'd spent a lifetime swallowing questions to keep the peace. So I finished the paperwork. I hugged him goodbye. I told myself I was imagining things. The night of the dinner, the one that cracked me open, was supposed to be a celebration, my father's birthday. Margaret cooked his favorite meal, roast chicken with herbs, the skin crisp and fragrant. The table was set with care. Candles, cloth napkins, everything looked warm and welcoming. Halfway through the meal, my father chuckled at a story I told about burning toast as a kid. "You always hated the smoke alarm," he said, smiling. Margaret laughed softly. "Oh, no, that wasn't you," she said, tilting her head. "That was your cousin, remember?" I froze. "No," I said gently. "It was me. I was about 8. She waved a hand dismissively. "I'm pretty sure it wasn't. Your father told me all about it." The room went quiet. I looked at my father. He shifted in his chair, eyes flicking between us. "Well," he said, unsure, "it was a long time ago." Something hot rose in my chest. "I remember it," I said. "Mom laughed and said—" Margaret cut me off, her smile tightening. "I think you're mixing things up. Memory can be tricky when emotions are involved." That was the moment, the exact second I felt the line being crossed. It wasn't about toast. It was about being erased in small, polite ways, about having my experiences questioned, reframed, softened until they fit more comfortably into someone else's version of events. I set my fork down carefully. Please don't correct my memories," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "They're mine." Margaret's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. "I'm just trying to keep things accurate," she replied, "for your father's sake." My father said nothing. The rest of the evening passed in strained politeness. When I left, Margaret hugged me again, whispering, "I hope you understand I'm only trying to help us all move forward." In my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, I realized something painful and clarifying. Forgiveness had made me vulnerable, and she knew it. She was using my desire for peace to position herself as the authority on a history she hadn't lived. The next few days, I replayed every interaction, every small discomfort I'd brushed aside. The way she spoke about my mother as if she were a footnote, the way she framed my boundaries as immaturity, the way my father deferred, retreating into silence when things grew tense. I'd forgiven him for leaving me alone in my grief years ago, but now he was doing something worse. He was letting someone else invalidate me right in front of him. That realization hurt more than any argument ever could. I knew then that this wasn't just about Margaret. It was about whether I would continue to make myself small for the sake of a fragile peace, or finally choose self-respect, even if it meant losing what little connection I'd rebuilt. The question was no longer if something had to change. It was how, and whether my father was willing or able to meet me where I stood. I didn't confront anyone right away. That surprised me too. You'd think after a moment like that, after being corrected about your own childhood by a woman who entered the story decades too late, you'd either explode or disappear. But I did neither. I went quiet. I did what I had always done best. I observed. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention, not just to what Margaret said, but to how she said it and to how my father responded when she did. When I called him, she often answered the phone first. "He's resting," she'd say, even when I could hear the television in the background. When I suggested meeting him for lunch, she'd interject gently, "Oh, we already have plans that day," before he could respond. She had a way of wrapping control in courtesy, of making exclusion sound like organization. I told myself she was protecting him, that maybe this was what love looked like in later years, buffering, simplifying, deciding things quietly. But the truth showed itself in small, undeniable moments. One afternoon, I stopped by to drop off a book my father had mentioned wanting to read. Margaret opened the door, surprised to see me. "Oh," she said, recovering quickly, "you should call first." "I usually don't. Dad never minded." "Well," she said lightly, stepping aside to let me in, "things change." Inside, my father sat in his chair by the window, reading glasses perched on his nose. He smiled when he saw me, genuinely this time. "You're here," he said, like it was a pleasant surprise rather than an inconvenience. Margaret hovered nearby. "She was just leaving," she said to him, not asking, but telling. I stayed. We talked about the book, about the weather, about nothing important, and yet the air felt heavy, like something unsaid pressing down on all of us. When I finally stood to go, Margaret walked me to the door. "You know," she said, lowering her voice, "your visits tend to unsettle him." I turned back. "Unsettle him how?" She sighed, as if burdened. "He gets emotional. He starts thinking about regrets. At his age, that's not healthy." There it was, clear, direct, the line drawn neatly across the floor. My relationship with my father isn't unhealthy, even if it's complicated. She smiled again, but this time there was no warmth in it. "I'm his wife," she said. "It's my job to protect his peace." As I drove away, her words echoed in my head. Protect his peace, as if my presence, my truth, were a threat. That night, I finally let myself feel what I'd been pushing down. The anger came first, sharp and surprising. I didn't confront anyone right away. That surprised me too. You'd think after a moment like that, after being corrected about your own childhood by a woman who entered the story decades too late, you'd either explode or disappear. But I did neither. I went quiet. I did what I had always done best. I observed. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention, not just to what Margaret said, but to how she said it and to how my father responded when she did. When I called him, she often answered the phone first. "He's resting," she'd say, even when I could hear the television in the background. When I suggested meeting him for lunch, she'd interject gently, "Oh, we already have plans that day," before he could respond. She had a way of wrapping control in courtesy, of making exclusion sound like organization. I told myself she was protecting him, that maybe this was what love looked like in later years, buffering, simplifying, deciding things quietly. But the truth showed itself in small, undeniable moments. One afternoon, I stopped by to drop off a book my father had mentioned wanting to read. Margaret opened the door, surprised to see me. "Oh," she said, recovering quickly, "you should call first." "I usually don't. Dad never minded." "Well," she said lightly, stepping aside to let me in, "things change." Inside, my father sat in his chair by the window, reading glasses perched on his nose. He smiled when he saw me, genuinely this time. "You're here," he said, like it was a pleasant surprise rather than an inconvenience. Margaret hovered nearby. "She was just leaving," she said to him, not asking, but telling. I stayed. We talked about the book, about the weather, about nothing important, and yet the air felt heavy, like something unsaid pressing down on all of us. When I finally stood to go, Margaret walked me to the door. "You know," she said, lowering her voice, Your visits tend to unsettle him. I turned back. Unsettle him how? She sighed, as if burdened. He gets emotional. He starts thinking about regrets. At his age, that's not healthy. There it was, clear, direct, the line drawn neatly across the floor. My relationship with my father isn't unhealthy, even if it's complicated. She smiled again, but this time there was no warmth in it. I'm his wife, she said. It's my job to protect his peace. As I drove away, her words echoed in my head. Protect his peace, as if my presence, my truth, were a threat. That night, I finally let myself feel what I'd been pushing down. The anger came first, sharp and surprising. Then grief, heavier and older, not just for what was happening now, but for everything that had never been resolved between my father and me. I realized then that I had forgiven him quietly, without ever asking for accountability. I'd assumed forgiveness meant erasing expectations, accepting less. But what Margaret was doing wasn't just overstepping, it was capitalizing on that silence. I decided to speak to my father alone. It took 3 attempts before I managed to catch him without her nearby. We met at a small diner we used to go to when I was a child. Same cracked vinyl booths, same burnt coffee smell. The waitress even recognized him. For a moment, it felt like stepping back into something familiar. I need to talk to you, I said once we'd ordered. He nodded, stirring sugar into his cup. Okay. I told him everything. Not dramatically, not accusingly, just plainly. I described the comments, the corrections, the way decisions were being made without me. I told him how small I felt in his house now, how erased. He listened, eyes fixed on the table. When I finished, there was a long silence, the kind that presses on your ears. Finally, he said, "She doesn't mean it the way you're taking it." I felt my shoulders sag. "That's what you said when I was 19, I replied quietly, "when you stopped coming home." He flinched. "She's just trying to help," he added. "She keeps things calm." "And what do I do? Stir things up just by existing?" He looked up then, really looked at me. His eyes were tired, older than I remembered. "I can't go back," he said softly. "I don't have the energy for conflict anymore." The words landed harder than any raised voice could have. In that moment, I understood something painful and final. My father wasn't choosing her over me. He was choosing comfort over truth, silence over repair. And he'd been making that choice his whole life. "I'm not asking you to fight," I said. "I'm asking you to acknowledge me." He nodded slowly, but didn't answer. When we left the diner, he hugged me longer than usual. He loved me, and I believed him. But love, I was learning, doesn't always come with protection. A week later, Margaret called me. "I think we should talk," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, prepared. We met at their house. She didn't waste time. "Your father told me about your concerns," she said, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I think it's important to be clear." I waited. "You're my father's daughter," she continued, "and I respect that, but I'm his present, his future. I won't have our life disrupted by unresolved emotions from the past." There it was, not hidden, not softened. "I'm not a disruption," I said. "I'm his family." She leaned back slightly. Families change. I felt something settle inside me then. Not rage, not despair. Clarity. Forgiveness had brought me back to the table, but staying there at the cost of my voice was no longer an option. I stood. "Then this is where I draw the line," I said. "You don't get to define my place in my father's life." Her eyes narrowed just a fraction. "You'll regret making things difficult," she said. I paused at the door. I already regret staying quiet. And for the first time since I'd reopened the door to my past, I walked away without feeling like I was running. Walking away didn't bring immediate relief. It brought silence. the kind that rings in your ears after a door closes too hard. For days after that conversation, my phone stayed quiet. No calls from my father, no polite check-ins, no carefully worded messages asking me to reconsider my tone. Margaret had drawn her boundary, and my father, true to form, had stepped behind it. At first, I told myself this was temporary, that he needed time, that he would call once the dust settled. But as the days turned into weeks, I recognized the pattern. I had seen this before. When things became uncomfortable, my father retreated, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of feeling like he had failed twice. I went about my life with an unfamiliar heaviness. At work, I found myself staring out the window more than usual. At night, I replayed conversations, wondering if I had been too harsh, too direct, too late. Forgiveness, after all, had always felt like something fragile. I worried I'd shattered it. Then, one afternoon, I received a message from my aunt, my father's sister. "Call me when you can," it read. Her voice on the phone was cautious. "I didn't know how to tell you this," she said, "but I think you should hear it from family." Margaret, it turned out, had been busy. She'd spoken to relatives I hadn't seen in years. She'd framed me as emotionally unstable, still holding on to childhood grievances, unwilling to let my father move on. She told them I'd been disrespectful in her home, that I'd made her feel unsafe. Unsafe. The word sat heavy in my chest. I realized then that what Margaret wanted wasn't just control, it was credibility. She was building a version of the story where she was the calm protector, and I was the unpredictable reminder of a past she wanted buried. The consequences were subtle but sharp. Invitations stopped coming. Family gatherings happened without my knowledge. When I reached out, responses were polite but distant. My father didn't defend me. That hurt more than anything Margaret could have said herself. I decided not to react immediately, not to call around explaining myself, not to plead for understanding. I had spent too many years performing calmness to earn a place at the table. This time I chose something different. I wrote my father a letter. Not an email, not a text. A letter, folded carefully, written slowly over 2 evenings. I told him I wasn't angry, that I understood his need for peace, but I also told him peace built on silence had cost us both too much already. "I forgave you," I wrote, "not because you asked, but because I needed to let go. But forgiveness doesn't mean disappearing. It doesn't mean letting someone else speak over my life. If there's no room for my truth in your present, then I can't keep showing up as a ghost of your past." I didn't accuse Margaret. I didn't list grievances. I spoke only of boundaries, of dignity, of what it meant to stay whole. I mailed the letter and told myself I wouldn't wait by the phone. A few days later, he called. His voice trembled when he said my name. "I got your letter," he said. I didn't realize how far things had gone. We met again, this time at a park, neutral ground. He looked smaller sitting on the bench, hands folded, eyes rimmed with red. "She's trying to help," he said automatically. "I know, but helping doesn't look like erasing." He sighed. "She's afraid of losing me." I softened then. So am I. That landed differently. For the first time, he admitted he'd allowed things to go too far because it was easier than pushing back, that he didn't know how to hold space for both his wife and his daughter without disappointing someone. "I'm tired," he said. "I just wanted things to be simple." "I wanted that too," I said, "but simple isn't always fair." He promised to talk to her, not confrontationally, he said, calmly. He asked me to be patient. I told him I would, but not at the cost of myself. What happened next wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no ultimatums, just quiet consequences. Margaret stopped calling altogether. When I visited, she was polite but distant, her warmth replaced by formality. Family gatherings resumed cautiously. I was included again, but not embraced. And my father began doing something small but meaningful. He started calling me himself. Not through her, not with explanations, just him. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, the news, a book he was reading. Sometimes we talked about my mother. Those conversations were halting, awkward, but real. Margaret never apologized. I didn't expect her to. What changed was me. I stopped shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. I stopped explaining my boundaries. I showed up honestly, even when it made the room quieter. The line she crossed had forced me to draw one of my own. And in doing so, I learned something important. Forgiveness can open the door, but self-respect decides how long you stay. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful, not at first. It was careful, measured, like everyone was learning a new language and afraid of mispronouncing the words. My father and I began meeting once a week, sometimes for lunch, sometimes just for a slow walk around the park near his house. He didn't talk much about Margaret. I didn't ask. What mattered was that he showed up without her shadow in the conversation, without the sense that every word might be reported or reframed later. Still, healing doesn't move in a straight line. There were moments when I caught him mid-sentence, glancing toward his phone as if expecting it to ring, moments when he'd lower his voice instinctively, even though we were alone. Those habits told me everything I needed to know about the balance of power in his home. I didn't judge him for it anymore. I understood now that fear doesn't disappear just because you recognize it. Sometimes it just changes shape. Margaret and I existed in a polite stalemate. When we were in the same room, she spoke to me as one might speak to a distant coworker, cordial, clipped, careful not to invite closeness. I returned the courtesy. No warmth, no hostility, just boundaries held firmly and quietly. What surprised me most was how much energy that boundary gave back to me. Without constantly scanning her tone or measuring my words, I felt lighter. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I noticed small things again. The way sunlight pooled on my kitchen floor in the afternoons. The comfort of familiar routines I'd neglected while trying to hold space for everyone else. One evening, my father came over to my house for the first time in years. He stood in my doorway, looking around as if stepping into a place he wasn't sure he was welcome. I realized then how rarely he had entered my world on my terms. "This is nice," he said, nodding toward the bookshelf, the photos on the wall. "You've made it your own." I had to. No one else was going to. He laughed softly, then grew quiet. We sat at the table drinking tea. The kettle clicked off in the background. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, filling the silence. "I should have protected you better," he said suddenly. The words startled me, not because I hadn't wanted to hear them, but because I'd stopped expecting them. I was scared of failing again. After your mother died, I didn't know how to be what you needed, and now, with Margaret, I didn't want to lose what little stability I'd found. I looked at him, really looked at him, not as the father I needed, but as the man he was, aging, tired, still learning far too late how his choices rippled outward. I didn't need perfection. I needed honesty. He nodded, eyes damp. "I know." That night didn't fix everything. Apologies never do, but it shifted something essential. It named the wound without reopening it. Margaret's reaction when she learned he'd visited me alone was quiet but unmistakable. She didn't forbid him from seeing me. She didn't need to. Her disappointment hung in the air, unspoken, shaping the atmosphere of their home. He told me this without accusation, without defensiveness. "She feels like she's losing control." I never wanted control. I wanted space. As time passed, family gatherings slowly recalibrated. People noticed the change, not in dramatic declarations, but in posture, in who sat next to whom, in whose voice carried weight in the room. Some relatives never quite warmed back up to me. I accepted that. When a narrative has already been written about you, not everyone is willing to revise it. I stopped trying to correct every misunderstanding. Instead, I focused on what felt solid. My father calling me on Sunday mornings, the way he asked about my life, not out of obligation, but curiosity, the moments when he gently interrupted Margaret to finish his own sentence. Those were small victories, quiet ones. Margaret never crossed the line again, not because she softened, but because she understood it was no longer invisible. She tested my forgiveness and found it came with conditions, that it didn't mean surrender. And I understood something else, too. Forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation to look a certain way. It doesn't demand closeness or shared holidays or forced smiles. Sometimes, forgiveness is simply releasing yourself from the role of peacekeeper. I stopped trying to make everyone comfortable. I let conversations end when they needed to. I excused myself without apology. I spoke plainly without sharpening my words to make them easier to swallow. And in doing so, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Whole. My father and I are still rebuilding. Some days feel easy, others feel fragile. Margaret remains part of his life, and I respect that without pretending it costs me something. But I no longer confuse endurance with love. The line she crossed taught me where mine needed to be drawn, and forgiveness, real forgiveness, didn't disappear when I defended myself. It finally had room to breathe. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in uneven waves, some days calm, some days unexpectedly heavy. There were moments when I'd hear Margaret's voice in my head, correcting a detail, reframing a feeling, and I'd have to remind myself that I no longer needed her permission to remember my own life. Old habits don't vanish just because you recognize them. They loosen slowly, like knots worked free with patience. One afternoon, my father invited me to help him go through the storage unit. He said it casually, as if it were no different from asking me to pick up groceries, but I knew what it meant. Those boxes, stacked and sealed, held the pieces of a life that had been quietly set aside. The unit smelled like dust and cardboard. We stood there, hands on hips, looking at rows of brown boxes labeled in my father's uneven handwriting, old photos, Christmas, misc. He hesitated. Margaret thought it was best to keep things organized, he said. I know, I replied. Let's just see what's here. We opened the first box together. Photo albums, school pictures, my mother's handwriting on the backs of Polaroids, dates, small notes, reminders of ordinary days that once mattered. My father picked one up and sat heavily on a folding chair, thumbing through pages slowly. I forgot how much she smiled, he murmured. I didn't answer. I let the silence hold him. We spent hours there, sorting. Not everything came home with him. Some things stayed boxed, but the difference was this: nothing was hidden anymore. Nothing was erased for the sake of comfort. When we finished, he looked at me, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and something like gratitude. Thank you, he said, for not giving up on me. I thought about that later, driving home, about how close I had come, not out of anger, but self-preservation. Forgiveness had brought me back into his life, but boundaries were what kept me from disappearing inside it. Margaret didn't ask about the storage unit. If she noticed changes, she didn't comment on them. She had learned, finally, that my presence wasn't negotiable, even if closeness was. The real shift came months later, quietly, on a holiday afternoon. The family gathered at my aunt's house. Laughter filled the rooms, overlapping conversations, the clatter of dishes, and familiar chaos. Margaret sat across from me, composed as ever, her smile polite but reserved. At one point, a cousin mentioned my mother, recalling a recipe she used to make. The room stilled for just a moment, the way it always did when her name surfaced. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. My father spoke instead. "She made the best peach cobbler," he said. "She taught our daughter how to bake it when she was 10. He looked at me when he said "our daughter." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was public. And Margaret said nothing. I realized then that justice doesn't always arrive with confrontation. Sometimes it arrives with acknowledgement, spoken calmly, firmly, in front of witnesses. After that day, something settled. I no longer felt like I had to brace myself before entering a room. I no longer rehearsed conversations in advance. If Margaret disapproved, she kept it to herself. If others believed her version of events, that was their burden to carry, not mine. My relationship with my father isn't perfect. It never will be. There are years we can't get back, words we didn't say when they mattered most. But we speak now, honestly, carefully, without intermediaries. And I've learned something important about forgiveness along the way. Forgiveness is not a reward for bad behavior. It's not an invitation to overstep. It's not silence or endurance or erasing yourself to make others comfortable. Forgiveness is a choice you make for your own peace, not a tool someone else gets to use against you. When Margaret crossed that line, she forced me to decide what kind of forgiveness I was offering, the kind that shrinks or the kind that stands. I chose the one that let me breathe. Sometimes I think about how close I came to confusing forgiveness with disappearance. For a long time, I believed that loving someone meant making myself smaller so they could feel bigger. That peace was something you earned by staying quiet. That being the bigger person meant swallowing words that deserved to be spoken. But life has a way of teaching you, gently or not, that self-respect is not the enemy of healing. Forgiving my father didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the years of silence or bring my mother back or turn us into the kind of family you see in old photographs. What it did was give me the chance to show up honestly, fully, without apology for the space I take up. And when his new wife crossed that line, she unknowingly gave me a gift. She forced me to decide who I was going to be moving forward, a woman who stayed quiet to keep the peace, or a woman who protected her dignity even if it made the room uncomfortable. I chose dignity. Not loudly, not cruelly, but firmly. My father and I are still learning each other. Some days feel tender, some days feel unfinished, but the relationship we have now is built on truth, not fear, and that matters more than perfect harmony ever could. If you're listening to this and you're standing at that same crossroads where forgiveness feels heavy and boundaries feel selfish, I hope you remember this. You can forgive someone and still say, "This is where I stop." You can love someone and still refuse to be erased. You can choose peace without choosing silence. So let me ask you something, honestly. Did you like this story? Would you have done what I did, or would you have chosen differently? Thank you for listening, for supporting this channel, and for spending this time with me. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and they matter more than you know. And if you haven't already, subscribe and support the channel for more real emotional stories like this one. Your support keeps these voices alive. Until next time, take care of your heart.